Our second speaker today is Dr. Rohan Llyod. Rohan is from James Cook University. He's going to talk to us about looking to the past for inspiration, the reef's history of competing values and how it could provide hope for its future. And I had your book in my hand before and then I put it down. Rohan has just published a book, Saving the Reef. So it's a history of anyway, Rohan can tell you about it and you can buy it and read it. It is for sale here out the front there. So I encourage you to grab yourself a copy of that. And I know Rohan will love to sign it for you. So Dr. Rohan Llyod is a historian who specialises in North Queensland and Australian environmental history. He has published histories on the Great Barrier Reef, North Queensland and Australian environmentalism. Rohan works as an English teacher at Ignatius Park College in Townsville and is an adjunct lecturer at James Cook University. Saving the Reef is his first book. So thank you for joining us, Rohan, and take the stage.
Thanks so much for having me today. I would also like to acknowledge the traditional owners on the land on which we gather, and I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Which direction does this go? If I press the big green button. All right, there we go. I would also like to acknowledge that I have images of deceased people in my presentation, and that I have permissions from the relevant organisations to use them. I must admit, I was hesitant about what I could offer an audience of social scientists. History has its own distinct set of epistemological ambitions. And although social scientists and historians might share flaws, buildings, or incorrectly partnered up within schools, when people believe that H in HAS refers to history, I think it is fair to say that historians and social scientists sit apart from one another. So I was very grateful when Tracy offered me a more defined topic to speak to. How does the reef's past inspire or influence, or how can the reef's history give us hope in our contemporary crisis? Originally, I thought I would talk about the clearly apparent ways in which the reef's past offers hope. My abstract for this talk states that the reef's past has threads and through lines of optimism that could prove useful in understanding how we can locate consensus in shaping the reef's future. I said I would rush through the reef's history of protection and conclude by remarking on how climate change provides substantial and new challenges for locating consensus, but how the reef's history remains a source of hope. In that talk, I imagined myself telling you all about the ways in which moments of protection and conservation in the past could give us hope for the future. History, particularly environmental history, is a useful source of heritage and hope. The past successes of environmental campaigns can provide a path forward, prove the ways to preserve our environment, and empower contemporary activist narratives. However, after more reflection, I decided I wanted to talk to something more than this. I wanted to examine the way the future-orientated perspectives such as hope and optimism by looking at moments of the reef's past when a sense of future was brought into question. When had people explicitly engaged with reef futures in the past? What had caused this future-orientated position? And what can the present learn from these moments? So today, I'd like to reach into the reef's past when both a sense of optimism was articulated, but also a less hopeful, but nonetheless future-orientated outlook emerged. The two periods, roughly a century apart, provide distinctly different ways of dealing with entanglements of past, present, and future, and provide salient differences to each other in our contemporary crisis. So to initiate this jaunt through time, I'd like to take us to the pearl shell fields of the Torres Strait in the 1870s. From around 1870 through to the 1940s, a hopeful source of reef income would be its perceptually unlimited sources of pearl shell, bêche de mer, and trocas shell. Oh, that worked well. While the three fisheries historically existed as distinct maritime enterprises, often with different bases, grounds, and leaders, in reef histories, they are often collated together. The principal reason behind this amalgamation are firstly that the fisheries were regulated by a single piece of legislation, the Pearl Shell and Bêche de Mer Act, and then later the Pearl Shell, Bêche de Mer and Trocas Act. The second reason, and arguably the most significant, was because of the ways the fisheries were often described by the boosters of the Great Barrier Reef in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. During that period, promotions of the reef's maritime resources were festooned with imagined or hoped-for wealth. Boosters for reef development in the past spoke in abstract about endless, unlimited, but unrealised resources. Fish lingered below to be dragged out of the lagoons. A fortune in coral gravel was accumulating in piles, and a whole ecology of produce waited to be plucked. Often, proponents of reef development, eager to bolster their claims, would point to profitable examples elsewhere in the world. Rarely could they list examples of burgeoning reef industries. The pearl shell, beche de mer and trocus fisheries were, however, uniquely discussed in these commentaries, principally because their industries had established infrastructure and, more importantly, histories of production. However, prior to 1881, when the first act was introduced, the pearl shell and beche de mer fisheries existed largely within the shadows of the colonies, particularly the Queensland colonial government. Within the literature of the time, the fishers were considered bold men, and this is largely a quote, risking shipwreck among unknown reefs and the probable horrors of a fight for life against the ferocious and cannibal natives of the mainland or of the islands. That's the end of the quote. Here's another one. Their rewards for their daring was a rich gold reef, a veritable jeweller's shop. That's the end of the quote. Of course, there were good years and bad years, but this was part of the cycle of the fishery. This precarious element of their work only added to the value of the rewards that eventually came. Nonetheless, reports had already emerged of fishers having to venture further into the deeps of the Torres Strait. This had consequences for the fishery itself, but also the indigenous peoples on Cape York and the Torres Strait. The fishers pushed the frontier further and violence often followed. By the 1870s, the Queensland government was concerned about the welfare of the fishery, but also the violence enacted by and upon the fishers, along with the poor regulation of those who ran the industry. Additionally, many of the operators were based in New South Wales, so most of the capital went to that government. With the passing of the Act, the fog was lifted, and for the first time, a proper accounting of the fishery began. By the end of the 1880s, both fisheries had enjoyed a brief boom. Year by year, however, the revenue decreased, and by 1888, the total value of the industry had nearly halved, despite global demand for shell and slug remaining quite high. Some fishers adopted innovations to allow themselves to go to the deeper waters, but the pearl shell fishery was seemingly in a crisis. In response, the Queensland government employed an oyster expert, William Saville Kent, as Commissioner of Fisheries to recommend a series of regulations to save both the pearl shell and beche de mer fisheries. The trocus fishery hadn't come into existence quite yet. Saville Kent suggested that additional police be introduced to protect Indigenous people from the fishers, and a series of other preservationist measures, size limits, cultivation grounds and exemptions, that he assured the government he had received approval for from leading boat owners. Many of these regulations were introduced in 1891. Now, I can't get into the crux of the objections by the fishers to Saville Kent's regulations, but many of their objections were based on a rejection of Saville Kent's assertion that he had consulted with the fishery. Others believed that the regulations favoured large company fishers, and as a result, the character of the fishery would crumble. Part of this debate centred around issues of fisheries management still relevant to today, the ways in which folk understandings and knowledges are displaced by outsider experts. However, generally, the objections were supported by a belief that the fisheries did not need regulation. The past had proven that booms and bust were part of the life of the fishery. Eventually, the beds would be replenished and rewards, like those of the past, would be realised. In response to the criticisms of Saville Kent's regulations, the Queensland government held a royal commission in 1897, which recommended the removal of the limits introduced 6 years earlier. The fisheries did not escape controversy for long. In 1908 and again in 1913, 2 more royal commissions were held into both the depletion of resources and the racial mix of the fisheries' labour forces. But these commissions failed to adequately redress the slow decline of the fisheries. The transcripts of these commissions indicate that a faith in the past obscured a thorough acceptance of the circumstances of the fishery at the time. Nonetheless, there remained a sense of optimism about the fishery's futures. Saville Kent, who published his book, The Great Barrier Reef, Its Products and Potentialities in 1895, said that the pearl shell fishery was capable of unlimited development. Frank Morehouse, a Queensland marine scientist, was sent to attend the Low Isles expedition in 1927 to 28 to specifically investigate the economic importance of the shells and slug. Other writers, fishery experts and scientists wrote about an imagined reef future in which the reef's economic importance would be realised through the development of all three fisheries. While there was some pragmatism to the way they articulated these ideas, their faith in the fisheries was still bound up in a romantic interpretation of their pasts. Images like the ones here accompanied tourist promotions of the reef, and together they suggested a boundless present and future. The idea of the fishery's success was explicitly tied to the value of the barrier reef more broadly. The collapse of the fisheries would signal a failure to value the reef. At the end of World War II, however, it was clear that the fishery was close to redundancy. A fourth inquiry, this time headed by the prominent public servant H.C. Coombs, was conducted into the pearl fisheries of Northern Australia. Like earlier commissions, the Coombs inquiry preached the need for regulations which could protect the fisheries from contraction. There was, however, unease in the final analysis, which was devoid of the optimism which had prevailed during the early 20th century. While earlier reports allowed the shellers' appeals to the past to dictate hopes for the future, Coombs used the fisheries history as evidence of its malfunction, and he said, "The history of this industry, like that of the fishing industry proper, has been marked by a frequency of commissions and investigations, which indicates that there must be many problems of the development and normal conduct of the fishery." At the time, H.C. Coombs was the Director General of the Department of Post-War Reconstruction. Australia had renewed its appetite in developing its tropical north following World War II. Alongside the inquiry into shells and slugs, there was also a significant review held into the reef's potential for tourism. In the decades following World War II, both the Commonwealth and Queensland governments sought to improve the reef's tourism infrastructure, increase investment in reef science, and locate potential for resource development. New leases were issued for a series of reef islands. From 1950, flights were offered between Brisbane and Heron Island and other Whitsunday Islands as well. The flights were particularly useful for ferrying scientists to the newly established Marine Research Station at Heron Island, which had been built in 1950. Later in 1961, an aerodrome was built at Proserpine, and by that stage, many of the Whitsunday Islands had new modern resorts to appeal to various tourists. As tourism spread, the visibility of the effects of tourism on the reef increased. While few suggested that development of reef tourism should be slowed, by the early 1960s, warnings had been sounded about the impacts both tourist enterprises and tourists themselves were having and could have on the reef in the future. Concerns for the reef seriously escalated in 1960 when the proprietor of Green Island's underwater observatory, Vince Vlasoff, first noticed the arrival of large numbers of crown-of-thorns starfish and its destruction of the coral around the island. That's a picture of Rob Andine cutting open a crown-of-thorns starfish. The story associated with the starfish is too long to get into now, but from the outset, despite uncertainty about why it had arrived in such significant numbers, the starfish became to symbolise ecological imbalance in the reef. As the concerns for the effects of tourism in the Crown of Thorns emerged, in the background, the Queensland and Commonwealth Government were laying the groundwork for the development of the reef's geological resources. Reef scientists, largely geologists from the 1950s, promoted the abundance of reef's coral gravels for cement manufacturing and conducted research into the reef's potential for oil reserves. And the one on the right is a report of the oil reserves or potential for oil reserves on the reef. Between 1953 and 1967, 37 authorities to prospect and exploration permits for petroleum had been granted by the Queensland government. Of those 37, 23 were granted in the reef area. Despite these developments, alarm bells were not yet ringing on the reef. But in 1966, the Australian Museum published a special magazine issue on the Great Barrier Reef. The papers in that edition pointed to the lack of scientific research conducted on the reef since the Low Isles expedition in 1928, as well as identifying issues which were of pressing concern in marine biology and geology. The articles highlighted research into reef fishes, clams, the reef's potential for oil, and an article on the crown of thorns. The very last article, written by the curator of molluscs at the museum, Donald McMichael, was called The Future of the Reef. McMichael believed that the building interest in developing the reef, along with the arrival of the crown of thorns, signalled, this is his words, the need for serious thinking about the future of the Great Barrier Reef. His article was filled with uncertainty and angst for the reef's future. He spoke to the perceived permanency of the reef, and he said, "Most people have regarded the reef as something completely permanent, of great age, and with a future stretching ahead just as long as it's past. They would probably agree that nothing we could do would conceivably affect the future of this enormous complex of coral reefs." End quote. He suggested that this was a misguided conception, and that if the reef was to be saved for posterity, then more needed to be done to understand it. Protecting the reef required an attitude change in terms of its management, but that wasn't possible based on what was known at the time. For McMichael and others, 1966 was a time of existential threat for the reef. They faced an unknown reef future and held little understanding of the reef at the time. Rather than losing hope, they used these communal emotions towards activism. In October 1967, McMichael would find himself in the Innisfail Mining Warden Court, providing an official objection to the mining of Ellison Reef for lime. Conservationists were successful in that battle because they argued against misrepresentations of that reef as dead, but also they highlighted the tragedy of a future reef characterised by lime mining. In another 3 years, a similar argument about the broader uncertainty about the reef and the potential damages caused by oil drilling were presented at the Royal Commission into petroleum drilling on the Great Barrier Reef. That commission recommended the establishment of the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority, an agency designed to manage the reef's competing uses and values into the future. Our current crisis is different to these two examples, the pearl shells in 1967. We are unlike those Torres Strait pearl shellers whose mythologizing of the past provoked their optimism and overshadowed their real issues. At a base level, we have their experiences to learn from and the knowledge of the value of fishing limits and zoning. But we also realise that we can't allow our past to dictate our current contingencies. Those in the 1960s didn't lean into the past. They held comparatively little knowledge of the reef, but used uncertainty to inspire others to face their crisis to save the reef from an unknown future. But we know significantly more about the reef system and its people. Beyond that, contemporary reef science even allows for projections of a grim reef future. I think hope and optimism are yoked to time and place. For us, I think, our biggest hurdle is the apparent slowness yet urgency of our crisis. Within the periods where the reef seems to be out of the news cycle, doubt and denial creeps in and action crawls to a standstill. We don't just face a shift in climate, but also an increasingly polarised politic that drains us of our hope. But we have the benefit of a full temporal gaze. Histories of the reef's past and a complete reckoning of the reef's present can equip us with the knowledges and understandings to inspire us to imagine and confront its futures right now. Thanks for listening.